Hello and welcome to the Labor John podcast, where today we're going to peel back the curtain and look behind the scenes of the working class history of the theater. My name is Sam, the stage manager. I'm joined by my friend and co-host Gabe, the grip. And in the studio we have two very special guests, but first I'm going to lead you over to Gabe Christie. Gabe?
Hello, and yes, we have two wonderful people joining us today. So, Bree and Natalie, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Hello, I'm Bree, or Brídín Clements Cotton. I work in the theater and in higher ed. My background is stage management. So I come from a stage management background, and now I'm instructor of stage and project management at New York University, Abu Dhabi. So I'm currently based in the Middle East, but most of my theater work has been in the US.
I'm Natalie Robin. I am a lighting designer by craft and a labor organizer by job. I work for a local of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees that represents designers for theater, film, TV, live performance. And we are the co-authors of a book called Theater Work, Reimagining the Labor of Theatrical Production.
Yes, and so we brought you two lovely folks on to talk about this book because there is a hell of a lot of information in it. And I guess I wanted to start with, if you can give just a very quick blurb for the book, and then what inspired the two of you to write it.
Sure. I mean, the big blurb is that the book looks at the past, present, and future of working conditions for theatrical production workers, the folks who work backstage, technicians, designers, some managers, to unpack the history of those practices, the current inequities embedded in the system, and some reimaginings of how the system could work in order to make the careers in this field sustainable and equitable. I'm going to let Bree talk about how this project started.
Thanks, Natalie. So we both have worked in the theater in different roles, in different types of roles and different types of organizations and projects. And I decided to study public policy rather than do a master's in theater or stage management or anything, mostly out of an interest in thinking about managing organizations and how policy works in relation to arts organizations. So I was studying public administration, focusing on management and leadership of nonprofits. And I just continued to learn about all these different things to do with managing an organization, like HR practices, how we hire, how we do goal setting with employees, who makes the decisions within our different types of organizations. And in particular, like board governance and how boards of directors function. And I kept thinking back then to the arts and to the theater production workplace in particular, and how different it is and how sort of extraordinary we consider the arts, and therefore we don't do interviews, and therefore you don't know who your supervisor is, these types of things, and trying to understand why is it so different, and then what potential issues does that create. So I found myself focusing in first on internship culture in the arts. So I wrote and published an op-ed about how the expectation and the culture of unpaid internships in arts administration and in the art and in theater really creates barriers to entry to the field, because there's sort of an assumption that people will have done one or two or three or more unpaid internships before they can ever get a paying job. So you have to have the support, for like a couple of years of your life to not be making any money and to then get your first paying job. And then I started to study more gender equity in the field and to think about lots of different systems within production. And it got to the point where after finishing the master's, then I was thinking about human resources and thinking about hiring practices and this access to education, and thinking about race and about gender and about ableism and various different types of discriminatory practices in the field, and just that we couldn't think about each of them separately, and we needed to start to like weave these things together. And the other sort of early part of it was in doing this research for school that there's so little written about this part of the labor force. There's data that exists about who's writing the plays. There's data that exists about who's on stage. There's data that exists about maybe like composers, choreographers, those areas. But who the technicians and the designers are, there's very, very little out there. And maybe in the past 10 to 15 years, there started to be a bit more. There's been a number of studies. So there's now some like quantitative data existing, but then there's not actually much about like what do we do with that data. So that was some of the very early inspiration, and then maybe Natalie can expand on that.
Yeah, I think in some ways, and related to what you all are doing with this podcast, right? Like it seemed really important that in order to illuminate this work, we had to look backwards in order to look forwards. And just to build on what Bree was just saying, like there is history. People have been trying to collect historical data, and it is extremely disparate and really hard to find. And so some of it was like, we just wanted to give people some context. Bree came to me with this idea about this being a book in late 2021. And we started working in 2022. I've known Bree for a really long time. She was, in fact, an unpaid intern for me at an organization that I produced for. And then she ran our internship program. So we are people who have benefited from this system. And that is part of the interrogation of it that feels important. And I've been working in theatrical production for over 20 years, as well as working in higher ed, teaching people to go into these fields. And I have a lot of questions about what that means. And then from a labor standpoint, we often identify as capital A artists before identifying as workers. And that, that's like the soapbox I might die on, I guess, which is we have to be workers first. And that's a really important part of this project for us, is emphasizing the ways in which actually the theatrical workforce is like other workforces more than it is different. So there's a lot of overlap with gig workers. There's a lot of overlap with restaurant workers. There's a lot of overlap with the trades. But because people identify as artists, work in the arts, come out of these sort of cultural hierarchies that start in some cases like middle school, there's people really don't see themselves as workers. And so they separate themselves from the larger labor battles, which ultimately just weakens us at the table. So that's part of my entry point into this, is to try to get people to think about themselves in the larger labor context.
And one thing I'll add to that is, in terms of where the book came from, is that we very much think of it as a contribution that hopefully others can build upon. We have questioned a lot, sort of, are we the people to be writing this book? Where do we fit into this? And we, as two white women who have various privileges, in particular, we were both really, really able to use our access, like what we have from working at higher ed institutions. So I've been employed by different higher ed institutions throughout the whole process of this book, and Natalie was for a portion of it. And we got funding, we got time off, we had various resources that allowed us to do this work. And we hope that, I always think that if there's a further edition of the book, we would not be the people writing it. Like, the hope is that we are empowering and creating a resource that others can continue to build on, and that it's just a small contribution into a much, much bigger conversation.
I'll just add one more thing, and then obviously there's other things to talk about. But I think also we chose to write a book because the people in power who can make some of the changes we wish would happen are people who believe charts in books. So we also sought out an academic publisher. Like, it gives the book a certain kind of respectability, in quotes, that we are hoping that then people who sit on boards will take more seriously than sort of the anecdotal conversations or the industry public, there, as Bree mentioned, there are a bunch of studies which we reference, and those are often published in like industry publications, which might not be accessible to like lawyer, doctor, board members. And we wanted it to be the kind of thing that could like sit on someone's bookshelf or on someone's desk and looks like a thing you're supposed to believe.
Well, board members do respond best to picture books, so that is, it's good you got some pie charts and everything in there.
And especially not to harp on it for too long, but the unpaid internship part, that my wife is an illustration grad from UArts, and the entire system at what was UArts now, sadly, was effectively set up with the assumption that, after graduation, it was impossible to find any work without having done 4 years of internship the entire time. And in order to do that, you not only need all of the connections to get into that, but then you also need to not have to have a job for 4 years. And yeah, just an immediate class barrier to entry. That became very apparent very, very quickly after graduation.
Yeah, and that perpetuates, as Bree said, for years, right? It's not like, oh, you have to do a summer internship right after you graduate. We're talking about people who work in unpaid or underpaid positions for years before they're considered professionals, also in quotes, and can get a job, which still likely won't actually pay them a living wage, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
And most of those jobs, or many of those jobs, come to you because of those internships. Like we found that over and over from workers we heard from, that when you ask somebody what their first paying job was, it was because of their internship, like what you're mentioning.
Yeah. And I've seen it, same thing in the museum field as well, that it's, if nothing else, just getting the connections from those internships, if not the experience itself. But when laying out questions for this, I had a lot of trouble because I could spend a solid probably 2 hours just picking your brains about the impact of the New Deal on theater production. But I'm going to force myself to not just rant about the Fair Labor Standards Act.
You're being conservative with that 2 hours. This could be a whole day thing.
Yeah, we might need to bring you back just for that. But so I wanted to focus instead on the past couple years and how, because I think one of the threads that Sam and I have been slowly pulling at with all of the people we've talked to is how COVID really just was like a 90-degree shift in every industry. And especially with theater being and especially from like a tech back of house side, it must be in person. There's not really a way to do any of that without some in-person work. So how did COVID impact the labor of theatrical production, and especially from a back of house perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to start by saying that live performance was the field that was closed for the longest. So we're talking about folks who were impacted by, on Broadway, a 16-month shutdown, but arguably not-for-profit theater leaders will tell you they are still not back to their full producing models. And are regularly still affected by people getting sick, right? As the pandemic continues, people are still having to like cancel performances, stuff like that. This was the first time for a lot of production workers that they were able to stop working. And it gave them a sort of unprecedented reflection on what the state of their jobs were, what precarious elements they had tolerated. That's a quote from the book. In large part because, and this is important to say, like the people who do this work love it. No one does this because they think they're going to get rich, right? That like people do it because they love it. And one of the reasons we wanted to write the book is in the same way that we think about, we organize a workplace because people like their job and want to make it better. We want to make the theater a place where people can have sustainable careers. But for a lot of workers, there just wasn't any work. So they could sit around and talk about what they missed about their jobs and what they didn't miss about their jobs. Anecdotally, a large number of folks were making more money on unemployment plus the $600 additional compensation than they were making working more than 40 hours a week in theater production. So that's a real eye-opening event.
Yeah.
And it's also true that based on a study conducted by an organization called Production on Deck and Portia McGovern, since work has come back, about a third of theatrical production workers have left the field permanently.
Wow.
And so those things feel really important. Like we wouldn't have written this book before 2020 because we didn't know those things. And again, it moved things from sort of the stuff you talk to your friends about at a bar after work into a larger public conversation. Bree, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of the initial sort of impacts of the pandemic on the field, you have covered it. I think just maybe to illustrate something that Natalie said in terms of how extremely it was felt within our field. So also that same study from Production on Deck and Portia McGovern, which was published in Stage Directions, they did the study 3 times. And in July 2020, what they found was that over half of the performing arts workforce was out of work. So they had 56% of respondents were either unemployed, furloughed, or unable to work due to illness. So in many areas, we found people not working, but in many areas, people did still have their jobs. In our field, we were really seeing people unemployed.
Yeah.
And then they did it again in January 2021 and in July 2021, and that slowly dropped, but a lot of that unemployment did continue for a long time. And then in terms of returning, that has we're still very much seeing the impacts. So the financial impacts of the pandemic on arts organizations has been huge. And I'd say we're in like the early to mid stages of realizing that impact. We still don't know where it'll sort of bring us. I think it's hard to talk about the impact of the pandemic without also talking about the racial reckoning that happened in that time and what we refer to as the pause in our book. So I don't know if we should continue into that.
No, that was my
Perfect
next
segue.
question. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to pick up there, Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the way that it was, we saw such a empowering and huge surge in protests because people weren't at work. The theater workers were really not at work. And the pause not only gave people time to think about the financial inequities and the safety concerns at work, but they also were the first time that people started to talk about the unspoken ways in which race in particular impacted the workforce. There's a group of 300 BIPOC theater makers who came together and wrote first a letter and then a list of demands known as We See You, White American Theater, which is a sort of, it's a document we reference throughout the book as a starting point for how to have conversations around the ways that things have been explicitly not serving a huge part of the workforce. And that covers everyone working in theater, not just backstage workers. And I think that there's so we conducted a study we had over 1,000 respondents from all over the country. And our study consistently reflected in demographics what every other production worker study says, which is that about 80% of the workers are white. That's obviously not representative of the American population. Yeah. And so is a big part of the conversation about why, like, when we talk about sustainability and when we talk about these careers, we're talking about them for everyone. And that's not who they're serving right now. It's pretty easy to have a perfectly fine long-term career in theatrical production as a straight, white, cis, able-bodied man. Like that is the easiest. And it just gets harder as your intersectional identities intertwine, right? Now I feel like I'm babbling a little bit. There's so much to say.
Welcome to the Labor Zone podcast. That's all we do here.
I guess I'll just wrap up to say that there was also, like, again, when you have a lot of people who are out of work, they have a lot of time to do some advocacy work. So a lot of really beautiful advocacy work came out of the pause. Some of which has continued and which we've tried to feature in the book as people who are doing on a small scale work that we wish could happen on a larger scale.
Mm-hmm. And just to tie it back to the 30s for a second, I think,
oh God,
my favorite thing, especially that you really see a lot in the 30s, or you saw a lot in the arts organizing that happened in the 30s, is when you have a lot of very pissed off and fairly militant artists that are protesting something. The works or the artworks that come out of that protest are always just fantastic. And yeah, just I don't like creatives being pissed off. I like what creatives do when they are pissed off.
Yeah, right.
Well, and I mean, it's interesting to think about how the WPA was like, we're going to make jobs for artists. And that's really not what happened in 2020. There was we're going to send you some money for 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And Sam, to your point earlier about doing all this, like how hard it is to do this not in person, theaters came up with some creative solutions, but those creative solutions in general meant fewer weeks of paid work for people. Like, yes, they would record things and stream them, but those things meant a couple of weeks of work instead of a 12-week run. Or there was a real financial impact on people's work lives, even when we started to come back a little bit. And yeah, I mean, I wish we had another New Deal.
Mm-hmm. The other thing about, as we're thinking about the racial justice reckoning in our field, something that we saw across other fields as well, but with the Black Lives Matter movement, was people demanding values statements from organizations and Black Lives Matter statements from organizations. So we saw a lot of that in the theater world. And then in the years since then, we're starting to see, and where we are right now is we're seeing if those values are being enacted. And particularly for us, our interest is in how those are being enacted within labor practices. So a big question we have asked ourselves throughout all of our collaboration together and with our research and throughout the book is, most arts organizations, like if I looked at the mission statement or the values statement of most theater organizations in the US, I likely agree with their values. But if I looked at what the people backstage are being paid or what breaks they're getting or, the on the ground, what's happening, those things would clash. And that's, so in these last few years, I think because those statements became so prominent, particularly due to the calls from the Black Lives Matter movement and from theater makers who are really making those calls, we're now able to see the contrast much more clearly than we were able to see it before.
And similarly, coming out of the summer of 2020 in particular, a lot of arts organizations, hired new leaders, often women of color, to many of the women of color leaders who we spoke to in the early research phase of the book are no longer at the institutions they were at. In some cases, they left due to the conditions, and in some cases, they were relieved of their positions, I will say. And in almost all cases, those folks, and not just the women of color, but the leaders of color in general, we have seen them take a huge amount of responsibility for decision making at those institutions that long predated their tenure, right? Specifically, like thinking about Natalie Garrett, who was the artistic director at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Near the end of Natalie's tenure, it was revealed that OSF had a more than 10-year discrepancy in their accounting. Natalie was not there for that time. She is no longer in that job. And in a lot of cases, these leaders of color who have left have been replaced by often people who had previous relationships with the institutions, often who are, if not white, are people with fewer marginalized identities. And it's just like what we're seeing now, and we start to talk about a little bit at the end of the book as it was starting to happen, is the reversal of these kind of unconsidered reactions to the demands of the workers, right? There's a lot of, we're going to fix this by doing this one thing. But it turns out you can't fix it by making zero structural change and just like slapping a new artistic director on top or eliminating one part of the inequitable work conditions. So I think now we're in the same way that we're in the sort of, what does the lack of funding from 2020 look like moment? We're also in a, what does it look like if you put a Band-Aid on a problem that you are not actually dealing with?
Yeah, and one other thing with those Band-Aid solutions that Natalie's mentioning, as she said, the We See You White American Theater laid out a number of both principles and of concrete things that organizations can do, concrete steps they can take to make their workplace more equitable. But organizations are treating that as a checklist. Like they're not so much looking at the principles, but more looking at least not every organization, but many folks who we spoke with we did start to hear that sentiment, right? That like, if we do this and this and this and this, we will be an inclusive workplace, as opposed to, what are the things that are happening and how do they reflect our values? So I think it feels like right now we're really in this sort of nitty gritty, like how do we actually make these changes, not just put Band-Aids on?
And so on that, can you expand a little bit more on how the theater industry itself is structured and like how are the decision making systems structured, if that makes sense?
First question is it structured?
Yeah,
this just sounds like it's not.
I think it thinks it's structured. It's important to say that our research specifically is around the professional American theater. So we are talking about workers who make the majority of their income working in theatrical production. A lot of the things we saw also exist in, community theaters and academic spaces, but that's not where our research lies. And I will say that there is more data around the not-for-profit sector than around the commercial theater sector. And arguably, in some ways, the commercial theater sector avoids some of these problems because it's not functioning under a board, like a governing board with executive leadership and then staff. So that's part of it. Our workforce is specifically a mix of full-time workers, seasonal workers, and what we call overhire or temporary or per diem hires. So folks who might be hired to work a day at a theater, might be hired to work several days, might be working 4 hours at one theater in the morning and 4 hours at a different theater in the afternoon. And so it's a very mobile workforce. Which is part of what gives institutions the permission to not care about the workers, right? Because you don't have to invest in people who only show up and work for you sometimes. And in our survey, we saw a pretty significant disparity between the complaints from folks who work as freelancers and the complaints from folks who have staff positions, right? Staff workers are more likely to have health insurance. They're more likely to have retirement benefits. They're more likely to know who their supervisor is. They're more likely to have interviewed for a job, which is not true of the freelancer workforce.
Mm-hmm.
Brady, you want to?
Can you also touch on union versus non-union?
Oh yeah. So, the union that represents most of the unionized backstage, what we'll call backstage or production workers, is the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. There are 171,000 members of the IATSE across theater, film, animation, gaming, all aspects of entertainment. So more than 50% of those folks work in live performance, mostly theater. We have no idea how many paid theater workers there are in this country. There's no way to know, but that is not all of them. And so there's a relatively low union density nationally in that way. In a lot of theaters, the backstage workers are the only non-unionized workers. Here in Philadelphia at the Arden, for example, which is a League of Resident Theater member, everyone except the production workers are members of a union. The designers, the directors, the actors, the stage managers are all unionized, and the production workers are not. And that's not uncommon.
IATSE Local 8 is listening.
IATSE Local 8 is doing a lot of good work, I will say. And they have in the past decade have unionized the workers at both Philadelphia Theater Company and the Wilma. But it's a problem nationally. And we have a strong IATSE local here, which is not true in a lot of places, right? So it gets worse other places. Obviously, unionized workers have more protections by the nature of being unionized. But because there's also just almost always a non-union person you can hire, the organizing work is hard, but also, and more importantly, there's really a way in which the industry treats production workers as expendable. Mm-hmm. And that is a thing that we saw over and over in our own experiences and in the research for the book.
Yeah. So just, I think building on what Natalie was explaining, or to specify like a few examples of the types of workers we're talking about in terms of thinking about how the field is organized. So if you are, say, like a technical director, you could be hired by a nonprofit arts organization, and that's your permanent job. So that's one type of worker that we're looking at. But you also could be a technical director just for a single show, in which case you might be hired by the production management company, the general management company. You might be paid by one of those companies, or you might be paid by the show itself, being managed by one of those companies. So that's a somewhat, or you might be hired for a season, right? You might be hired on a seasonal basis for a summer stock or something where you're doing that for 3 months for a bunch of shows. But if you're like an assistant costume designer, you, again, could be hired by a theater, but unlikely, or like permanently. More like you're going from show to show. But the person who's bringing you on is probably the costume designer. The person who's paying you is likely one of either the organization or the show or the general management or the production management. So there's all these things. Like it's not clear cut at all, which is how we then get to this precarious work environment, right? That's what leads to a lot of the questions we're really interested in, is when something then happens to you, who do you talk to, and what recourse is that? Because as Natalie explained, the employer often doesn't feel responsible for the worker because the worker might not even be working for them. It's really messy.
We also have the problem that especially designers and assistant designers, but actually workers in all of these crafts are often misclassified as independent contractors. To be clear, we are not independent contractors. And the Department of Labor agrees that we are not independent contractors. However, theaters often pay those workers on 1099s, which gives them even less of an investment in the workers. It also means that the workers are not protected by like some of the most basic workplace protections. We particularly, this is particularly an issue for United Scenic Artists, the local that I work for, because as you guys know, you have to be an employee in order to be able to unionize. And so we are constantly fighting an uphill battle in which we insist that, and all our contracts say that the workers are employees, but they're still paid in a fee-based way. And the fee-based structure is wildly inequitable, right? Because it doesn't take into account anything about time. It values or prioritizes workers who work quickly, which prioritizes workers who don't have caregiving responsibilities, who are not disabled, who perhaps don't have to work another job, right? Somebody who can work fast and efficiently makes more hourly pay out of a fee than somebody who can't for whatever reason. It also prioritizes urgency and perfectionism as like white supremacy values, right? Like you don't get to make mistakes because every time you make a mistake, you get paid less, essentially. And so that's another one of the ways in which the workers are precarious, which is like they don't know who they work for. And often even the employer that they do work for is sort of in denial about that.
I think on that note, sorry.
I was just going to say, it sounds like it would be, I mean, on paper, you could probably figure out how to establish a bargaining unit there, but by the time you're done doing that, the show's over and everyone's contract is up.
Yeah, we can almost never organize on a single show basis the folks who work on the show before the opening night. When we organize a single show, we're typically organizing the folks who are employed to make the show happen night after night for a open-ended run. But yeah, a show that's going to run for 4 weeks, there's no way. We just can't work fast enough. Yeah, you're totally right. Sorry, Bree, you were going to say something else.
Oh, well, just in talking about the fee-based structure and the pay inequity there, I think we can't not mention in particular where the costume professions play in here, because one of the ways this sort of plays out in our field with the inequities of fee-based work is that so-called women's work has ended up being one of the lowest paying areas within theater. So the labor of garment work has traditionally, I think, as many folks know, in many different parts of in other industries as well, been considered feminized work, women's work. And in theater, what we see is that the costume designers are expected to do much, much more than all the other designers for the same fee. So a lighting designer would have electricians, technicians, these different people doing the work. The costume designer would be expected to actually physically do a lot more of that work: measurements, shopping, swatching, these kinds of things. Natalie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a real lack of pay transparency, especially in the non-unionized work. And there's also a real weaponization of what's known as
favored nations.
Thank you, favored nations, which is the idea that like all of the designers on a project get paid the same thing. That would be great if everyone had the same workload. But everyone doesn't have the same workload. Set designers are employed for a longer period of time, typically than lighting or sound designers. And as Bree said, costume designers are often responsible for the physical labor of their craft in a way that the other designers are not. And it's also true that, for example, like there's an effort right now to unionize a lot of costume shops, but historically the shops you might hire to build the costumes for a show have been non-unionized for a very, very long time. And even if every other shop on the show is unionized, right. The scenery is built by a union shop. The lighting is installed by union workers. The sound equipment comes from a union shop, but the costume shops are not unionized. They are, as I'm sure you will not be surprised, often the employees of those shops are more likely to be women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQIA community. So, already folks who are facing structural barriers then have even less support. And a lot of those shops, I mean, really came out of a sweatshop mentality and the garment workers mentality. I mean, they don't work that way anymore. Obviously, like they comply to the law, I think in most ways, but we're talking about people sitting and hand sewing thousands of beads onto a garment that someone's going to wear 8 shows a week. So it's really that kind of craft. The same thing is true. The other most sort of gendered or feminized craft that we talk about is scenic artists, which is historically also a feminized craft. I don't know why that is, but it has been true. And also a less supported and more underpaid historically in live performance field.
Mm-hmm. And to illustrate a little bit of what those numbers are, one of the studies that we looked at Broadway numbers in 2019. And so if we're looking at scenic, 94% of the carpenters were men and 6% were women. 92% of sound personnel were men and 8% were women. And then when we get to wardrobe, 35% of wardrobe personnel were men and 65% were women. 34% of hair and makeup were men, 66 women. So they are pretty drastically different. We're not talking about, a small percentage there.
I had expected it to be stark, but not quite that stark.
It's really, I mean, and it starts in the education system, right? Which is that, like, I've seen, male presenting humans who are good at drawing be encouraged to look at scenic design and architecture. And I've seen female presenting students be encouraged to look at fashion and costume design.
Yeah, so that's something, that we didn't get into in depth in the book, but we were really interested in our early outline. We had a chapter that we know that didn't make it into the book, but of sort of how do other things that we study in school lead to this and lead to these then discrepancies. For example, like who is pushed into STEM things and how does studying computer science actually also equip you for lighting design and sound design and do some of the so then what are the parallels in gender representation and so on across these different fields
One other thing that I wanted to touch on, because the kind of the piecework aspect of it and the urgency and everything, that also, at least my brain flagged that as also being a major workplace safety issue. That whenever your pay is connected to getting something done in a timely manner, you're going to do something unsafe along the line at some point. So what kind of just day-to-day risks go into
what specific OSHA regulations?
Yeah. What have you
names
seen?
and numbers?
I can share a conversation I had with workers on Thursday. We're in the process of we've organized and are in the process of negotiating a first contract for a regional theater. And I had dinner with a bunch of the scenic artists and we were talking about safety stuff. And they were like, yeah, I mean, we're really great at wearing our respirators until it's like we're running behind and then who has time to do that? And I'm like, well, your lungs would like you to have time to do that. So our workers, I mean, 100%, the urgency, the mentality of the show must go on prioritizes the product over the workers across the board. We see theatrical technicians are encountering all of the same safety hazards as folks working in the trades. So hazardous chemicals, breathing particulates, power tools, working at height, working outside or in extreme temperatures, with or without appropriate ventilation, working and are much less likely to have appropriate professional training in doing those things. One of the things that we talk a lot about in the book is that there's a idea that in order to become a theater worker, you should go to a school and get a BA or a BFA in theater. And if you want to become a professional carpenter, you might do an internship with the Carpenters Union or an apprenticeship, with the Carpenters Union. If you want to become a licensed electrician, you'll do an apprenticeship with your appropriate IBEW local, where you will learn actually how to do those things safely. So not only are we talking about an unprotected workforce who is working in essentially live construction sites all the time, we are then talking about folks who are much less trained, often expected to figure it out on their own, often not supervised by someone who knows how to do the thing they're being asked to do, and functioning under a pressurized deadline around this idea of opening night.
Mm-hmm.
And tired.
And tired.
And I'm sure sometimes a smaller budget as well.
For sure. I mean, one of the biggest, this just came up last week, was the workers were like, we're understaffed and the same amount of work has to get done. And so the expectation is that all the workers are just going to work harder for longer hours. We cite some research studies around fatigue and railway workers and tie that to the fatigue felt. If you're working, first of all, in theater, often 6 days a week is the standard, not 5. And at various parts of the process, the typical workday is as long as 14 to 16 hours without a protected turnaround period. So we're talking about people who are tired. We're talking about people who are, again, like doing things that they may not really know how to do correctly, and certainly may not have the appropriate support. We're talking about people who are often working alone. The number of stories that I've heard about workers who are on a lift or a ladder alone in the theater late at night, like that's not, there's no part of that OSHA supports.
Yeah. And in addition to all of the physical safety hazards, a lot of the sort of culture of theater making makes it a space that for emotional and psychological safety issues. So as many of us know growing up, there's this idea of the theater family, that we all love what we're doing. We're all doing it all these hours. And there's this idea of like, that we bond through this work and that we don't have the same types of, say, like social barriers or protections within the social spaces as well. And there's far fewer safety practices in place for when something goes wrong that's not related to your physical safety, right? So the amount of sort of like sexual harassment that is really, really prominent amongst the theater work, both with all workers on stage and backstage, all types of workers. And so in our research, we found that is much harder to quantify and to tackle. Like it's much, much harder to understand what practices could help make it less risky in those ways.
Yeah.
And we're also talking about working to go back to the employers who don't feel responsibility for their employees.
Yeah.
Especially the temporary overhire workers often like have no access to HR. They often don't have access. They don't even, they very rarely receive the sort of safe workplace trainings that other members of the staff might be expected to do. They often don't have access to the employee handbook. And again, if you don't know who your supervisor is, or when your supervisor is the person causing you harm, like how do you deal with that? It's also true that as in any freelance or gig-based work, speaking up, there's, people are directly afraid of speaking up and then not being hired again, right? So when you're talking about a precarious work environment, this is really where it's like restaurants. If you are the quote unquote squeaky wheel, if you make trouble, like they just don't have to hire you again. Yeah. And you don't have to deal with, being fired without cause or whatever, because you're not being fired. You're just not being hired back. And we've seen innumerable cases of folks, there's a really strong whisper network, I would say, of like, you don't want to work at these places. You don't want to work for these people. And even from a union standpoint, like we represent designers and assistant designers. If the designer is harassing an assistant, or if one designer on the team is harassing another designer, duty of fair representation says we have to represent all of our members. That often doesn't give us a lot of clear recourse for how to help facilitate those situations.
Yeah, I think it's just really worth like pausing in regard to this fear component is just huge in our field. And like I hear it every single week in the workplace, in every theater workplace I've ever been in, this fear, this idea that I can't raise this. One, because even I don't know where to raise it, but even if for folks who do, there's such a massive fear that you'll be penalized by, like Natalie said, by not getting the future job. I find it just so sort of shocking and like it's just so sad that it's still so present, even when we've been having all these conversations and when we had the pause and we talked about all of this, and still like we encounter it all the time.
And a lot of the people who we surveyed talked about leaving the industry because of these things. And so what's happening is that people who love their work and are extremely skilled at their craft are leaving the field either because they can't afford to stay or because it's not safe for them to stay, or in a lot of cases, both.
Wait.
It's really uplifting. Yeah. Our research is really...
As our first review of our book said, it's harrowing research.
Well, we'll try and finish this on a slightly more positive note. So, short of a complete overthrow of the capitalist system and reformation of society.
Oh God.
Where do you think, or like, where would you like to see the theater world go from here? Like, what are some actionable steps that you think could at least start the process moving in the right direction?
Well, we identify as hopeful optimists, which is a way that Natalie said that recently that I just love, because it is sort of the basis of our book, is that we're trying to illuminate this research because we are hopeful about the future of the field. And we want there to be a version where people can happily continue to have careers in theater. So the third section of our book is really thinking about these reimaginings and not providing any sort of checklist. We very much believe we do not have the answers, and we are asking questions in this book. But we've identified sort of 4 large themes that we hope can guide some reimaginings about the future. So the first of those themes is universal design, which I think many folks are familiar with the concept of universal design, which is basically designing objects or systems or anything in a way that suits every person encountering it. So not designing a chair for a able-bodied person of a certain height, but designing a chair so that it's accessible to any person. Sorry, that's a bad example. I feel like I should be more specific. But doorknobs, perhaps.
We love the doorknob example, which is that you should put a doorknob at a height that is accessible to someone using a mobility aid in a wheelchair who is at the full range of human height.
I always use the worst examples of simple universal. I was like, I'm in a chair, but like this chair is on wheels. It doesn't have brakes. That wouldn't be accessible for every person. A chair without a back, like there's always.
There you go. You made it work.
But from a system standpoint, theater, especially backstage work, has been not designed with everyone in mind. I mean, it's a system that's been designed for, if you're expecting workers to work 16 hours a day, there's sort of an assumption that there's someone else who's going to clean their house or buy their groceries.
So they have no other responsibility.
Right. It's not designed for caretakers, and certainly not for primary caretakers. It's not designed financially for folks who don't have a financial safety net. We've actually seen historical data in our contracts that indicates that the assumption about the origin of some of our fees lies in the idea that this was not someone's primary source of income. But now we're asking people for this to be their primary source of income. So this is the kind of systemic universal design questions that we're thinking about.
Yeah. And this one felt sort of silly to even include in the book. Like it felt like every so often Natalie and I would say to each other, like, do we even need to, like, universal design feels a little bit obvious, right? The idea of designing a workplace for any worker. But the number of times we hear, oh, like, well, I did this, so you can do this in our field. And these kinds of, like, the sentiment is, well, it's not been a great workplace for the last 100 years, so everyone can make it in this, as opposed to how do we actually make it accessible to every worker. So that does feel to me like a bit, like, quite broad, and also quite, of course, this would be better, but it still felt worth saying.
Yeah, it's like someone climbing the top of a hill saying, "Oh, I climbed this hill. Why can't you?" Instead of putting your hand down and helping them up. You know,
It is literally that, Sam. It is literally that.
And also that gets to the difference between equity and equality, right? Like, we're talking about equity, making it accessible for every person, no matter, like, of every ability, of every, coming from every background, not just equal.
Yeah. The second thing that we talk about, which I got to a little bit with apprenticeships, is disrupting the norms of professional training in the field. This is connected to unpaid internships and the idea that you have to work at an unpaid or underpaid level. It's also connected to the assumption that you have to participate in higher ed. When I taught at UArts, I ran the design program there. I had students who graduated with $200,000 of debt to go into a field that wasn't going to pay them a living wage. Yeah. Like, that's a broken system, right? And we looked at things like, I really love the IBEW Local 3 apprenticeship program, because at the end of the apprenticeship program, not only are you a member of the union, but you also graduate with an associate's degree, right? An accredited associate's degree. And there's some amount of funding, I think, available based on an application basis to continue that education. Like, why? And you're paid to do that work. Like, why isn't that the model? Right? It just seems so obvious. And also the ways in which these cultural assumptions about theater start in the educational system. The idea of, like, I stayed up the longest, I haven't been to sleep yet, I painted the floor all night, I work harder than other people. That really ableist, urgent, perfectionist mentality starts. I mean, I taught at the college level, and those things were deeply embedded in my students by the time they got to college. So it's starting in middle school or high school,
And the idea that you can only participate in your theater show in middle school if you do nothing else for those few months. It starts really, really early.
Yeah.
The other thing about that, the disrupting the norms of professional training, is I think that a lot of our questions come back to this idea that we do need to we do need to learn by doing. And Natalie and I agree with that. Like, we believe that the type of work that we do is learned by doing, but that people shouldn't be working without pay. So that's the challenge, right? Is figuring out, I think in theater across the board, we have not yet figured out how a system that allows people to safely learn by practicing, and also have the protections, have space to make mistakes, and have it be a sort of supportive learning space as well as making space.
And this is connected back to some of the things we mentioned earlier, which is that what we've seen in terms of institutions like checking the box of getting rid of unpaid internships is that they're either eliminating the internship program completely or promoting the interns or apprentices to staff. But then, because that costs money and they haven't figured out where the money comes from, there's just fewer people to do the work. So sure, you're not using slave labor. That's great. But you're also not creating safe, equitable workplaces for the workers that you have.
And there's also, with the sense of urgency, and like in that situation, there's no place where someone can make mistakes and get feedback and everything without the fear of it impacting the show and therefore their future employment.
Yep. The third thing that we have 4 of these sort of ideas in the third section of the book. The third thing is that we need to share the proverbial wealth rather than hoard it, which we believe in every way. But this is connected in a lot of ways to shared leadership models, There's an example that we use of 4 arts organizations in Pittsburgh who each individually cannot sustain a full-time human resources staff. And so they hired a single HR person to support all 4 institutions.
Damn.
Which is better than not having an HR system at all.
I mean, that is true.
Right. And in some cases, like, seemed sort of successful. At the time that we talked to this human, she had some concerns about how it was going. She no longer has that job, and that job doesn't seem to exist anymore. So we don't really know what happened. But there are some other models, of in a resource-based sharing way that's often physical. Like here in Philly, a lot of the not-for-profit theaters have a sort of shared library of things. Like, oh, I need some curtains. Can I borrow your curtains? Oh, I need some platforms. Can I borrow your platforms? And we're interested in some ideas where that might include humans. Like, how can we support individual workers and institutional work by thinking in a broader model?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in terms of the sharing of the wealth, some of our potentially radical sparks of reimagining have to do with part of what we focus on in the book is workplace practices such as how do you set goals with employees who work for a different organization every day? How do they get feedback? These kinds of things. And something that we don't have the answer to but are trying to brainstorm is, are there ways that those types of systems could not be specific to a single organization? Like, is there some way that a lighting designer or a lighting technician could participate in these systems in some form that supports them as a worker, supports them as part of various different teams, even though they're employed by different people each day, or maybe by 2 different employers in one day? So it's like, I think the sharing of the wealth is shared leadership, shared physical resources, but also like, how do we share in these systems, which we're sort of, I would say, like we're still thinking about together ourselves. But we hope in the book to at least sort of ask some of these questions of getting at how broad rethinking could this be, to really not think in these silos per institution.
Mm-hmm.
And Bree mentioned shared leadership models. And just to be clear, we are not talking about like an artistic director and an executive director, like a dual leadership model. We're actually talking about models which various theaters are starting to use, where there's really a distribution of the leadership at the top of that hierarchical pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
Both Philadelphia Theater Company and the Wilma have these models now.
Mm-hmm.
We talked to folks at Detroit Public Theater, where there are multiple artistic directors, also City Theater in Pittsburgh. And one of the advantages that we see in this model is that it doesn't put so much pressure on a single leader to have all the answers or be able to solve all the problems or even know what all the problems are, right? There's a way in which if we build a community of leadership, we can then build a community of care by distributing the pressure, because those folks too feel the pressure both to get the shows up and running,
Sure.
to raise enough money, to be responsible to their board, whatever. Like it's a very stressful job. And why not distribute that across several people?
And the fourth and final of our big reimagining themes is that we believe we need to disrupt the way that the American theater is funded, which is a large one.
Yeah.
So again, this really gets back to what Natalie said early on, which is there is the difference between the commercial model and the nonprofit model, but both could use a lot of disruption. But in the nonprofit model in particular, something that we focus on a lot in our book is about board governance and the disconnect, again, between the values, the people making funding decisions, and what's happening on the ground. So we're really interested in how these value statements then are managed in terms of boards being responsible for the fiduciary responsibility and not, but then the art leaders typically being the ones who actually know the operations, like the executives. So again, we're not proposing an answer here, but we do believe that there's some massive rethinking about how these financial systems exist, and particularly where the funding is coming from, and therefore who has decision-making power should be a part of that rethinking.
Yeah, and part of that is also divesting from the sort of donor based, or that in almost all cases are not for profit funding comes either from individual or foundational donors. And so we're talking about building an entire industry on the generosity of some rich people. And
it's usually product focused, not people focused.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the things that we see in this field over and over again is that it's quote unquote easier to raise money for a new building than to pay people more. And because of the focus on product, there's a real lack of interest in redividing the budget pie to be human focused rather than object focused. I myself have worked on some shows recently where I went over budget on the lighting equipment and they were able to find more money for the equipment, but they were not able to find more money for my assistant, who is an actual human doing actual work in the room.
Yeah.
And that is a thing we see repeated over and over again. One of my colleagues cites an example of there are two theaters that have the same tier status in terms of contracts. And at one of them, she's like, my fee is $3,500 to design the show. And the budget for the stuff is $7,500. And that feels fine. But at another theater that is the same tier, her fee is still $3,500 and the budget is $75,000. And how is that okay? Wow. She's doing the same amount of work.
Yeah.
Right. But there's all this extra money for fancy things and not humans.
Yeah.
And that is part of this disrupting of the funding, is not just where does it come from, but where is it going? And does a theater that should we be building a new lobby for a theater company that can't pay its workers a living wage? Should we be supporting these institutions, quote unquote, artistically, if they're not supporting their workers? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. The one idea that just popped into my head is to sell naming rights for pay scales. So you can have...
Oh, love that.
The Jerry Lenfest Memorial Pay Scale.
Yeah, right. People will sell their lobby or their staircase. I was just in a new building in New York where, no joke, literally everything is named. Every staircase is named. There's dressing room names. There's the prop shop has a name. I mean, it's crazy. And but the humans are not, their fees are not named.
And that does align with what is being done with the pay equity standards, not named, but the idea there is a fair trade stamp, a pay equity stamp on arts organizations that uphold these standards, which are developed on our team. Is that right, Natalie?
Yeah, which is a group out of Chicago, started mostly by costume professionals. And their two main focuses are pay equity and tied into that pay transparency, because we can't have pay equity if people can't talk about what they make.
I think we have covered a lot.
Are we ending on a good note?
I think we're ending on a better note.
We think it can get better.
Yeah.
Hopeful optimists.
There we go.
I don't have any more questions. Do you have anything else, Sam?
Buy this book. I look forward to Theater Work 2. You said you won't be writing the next book, but Theater Work 2, The Show Must Go On. I'm sure someone's going to write that one, and I look forward to reading that as well. So thank you for Natalie, Bree, for coming on.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
And if you can afford it, buy an extra copy and mail it to any theater boards of directors or executives that you might know, and just give them a present.
Yes, please.
Well, thank you both for talking with us today. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This has been the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sponsored podcast. Thank you for listening.